Smoke still curled from the shattered wagons as the Apache warrior knelt in the dirt, his broad hands sifting through a bundle of blood-stained papers that had spilled from a leather satchel, maps marked with lines he could not follow, letters heavy with meaning he could not grasp, and though he turned them this way and that, the black scratches mocked him like chains tighter than any iron. Around him his brothers laughed, holding rifles and coins, proud of their victory, yet he felt only the old gnawing shame in his chest, the secret he had hidden since boyhood, that for all his strength, he could not read a single word of the white man's world. A soft voice broke through the clash of tongues, a voice he almost ignored until it quivered again. I can read them." He looked up sharply, expecting defiance, but saw instead a woman kneeling near the wreck, her hands bound with a scrap of rope, her dress torn but her eyes unbroken. She was young, no more than 20 summers, her face pale with fear, yet lit by a quiet strength. And she spoke again, clearer this time. "If you wish to know what they say, I will tell you." The other warriors jeered, calling her a captive with a dangerous tongue, but he silenced them with a glance, drawn by something deeper than the words themselves. He pushed one paper toward her, his voice low but commanding. "Read." She steadied her breath, fingers brushing the page as though it were holy, and in that moment he realized it was not the letters he hungered for, but the sound of her voice, the way it carried through the smoke like a river finding light. She read of supply wagons, of towns and trails, things that should have stirred strategy, but instead he found himself watching her lips, the way courage lived in each syllable despite the danger that surrounded her. When she faltered, he leaned closer, his shadow falling over her, and asked again, "More." She obeyed, though her cheeks flushed, and the warriors behind him muttered that no outlaw should treat a prisoner as anything more than a spoil. He ignored them, caught in the strange power of this widow's words, and as she read on, he felt a fire that was not born of battle, but of something far more dangerous, the first spark of desire. By the time the sun dipped low and the smoke thinned into silence, he knew only two truths, that he could not read, and that the woman before him had just begun to teach him far more than letters. That night the camp settled into uneasy silence, fires flickering against the dark horizon, and the Apache warrior carried the bundle of papers to the edge of the flames where the widow sat guarded, her wrists freed, but her place among them still uncertain, and he dropped the satchel beside her with a weight that made her startle. "Read," he commanded, his voice deep but softer than before, and though her hands trembled, she obeyed, spreading one page across her lap so the glow of firelight revealed its hidden lines. She read aloud a letter written to a colonel's wife, words of longing and love mixed with the rhythm of war. And as she spoke, her voice smoothed the harshness of the night, quieting even the men who had first scorned her presence. He leaned closer, his sharp profile outlined in orange light, and asked her what certain words meant, pointing with a calloused finger at marks that had baffled him all his life. She explained patiently, repeating phrases, her small voice steady even as his nearness made her cheeks burn. He listened with an intensity that unnerved her, his eyes never leaving her face, and for the first time since the battle she felt less like a captive and more like a teacher, a role that gave her dignity back. When she faltered on a sentence heavy with sorrow, she lifted her eyes and found him watching her not with suspicion, but with something that felt like hunger and reverence all at once. She swallowed, forced herself to go on, and as the final words left her lips, he nodded once, as if sealing the lesson not only into memory, but into the bond forming between them. He placed another page in her hands, this one a map of rivers and mountains, and asked again, "Tell me what it says." She hesitated, then explained each curve and mark until the land itself unfolded in his mind, and he realized that her knowledge gave him a power no weapon could. He reached for her wrist gently, turning it so that her pulse beat under his thumb, and said in a low tone, "You will teach me more." The vow carried more weight than a threat. It was a promise that unsettled her heart and sent a warmth through the night that no fire could match. Behind them, whispers stirred among the warriors, uneasy that their brother sat so close to a prisoner. But he did not move away, and neither did she, for in the crackle of firelight they both knew that something had begun, something neither war nor law could easily extinguish. By the next evening the widow sat near the fire. Again, this time without the trembling she had felt before, for though she remained a captive among strangers, the Apache warrior's presence beside her had begun to weave a fragile sense of safety, and when he placed a scrap of parchment in her lap and a piece of charcoal in her hand, she understood what he sought even before he spoke. "Write my name," he said, his voice low yet steady, and she hesitated, glancing into his dark eyes that reflected the fire as if they held the blaze themselves, before slowly forming the letters across the page. He leaned close. So close she could smell the smoke in his hair and the leather of his vest, and he traced the shapes she had made with a rough fingertip, his lips tightening as though he wished to force the knowledge into himself through sheer will. She whispered the sound of each letter, guiding him as he repeated them with care, and when he stumbled, she smiled gently, her hand brushing his in correction, a fleeting touch that lingered longer than necessity demanded. He fixed on her smile, a rare softness breaking across his stern face, and asked her to write again, but this time she scrawled her own name beside his. 2 words joined on the page. He stared at them for a long moment, then repeated them both until they rolled from his tongue like an oath, her cheeks flushing as though the act had bound them together before any vow could be spoken. Around the fire, his brothers muttered uneasily, calling it folly for a warrior to sit with a widow and play with marks on paper, but he silenced them with a look so sharp they fell quiet. She felt the weight of those stares, the disapproval pressing from every side. Yet when he placed the charcoal back in her hand and demanded she teach him to write the word wife, her heart thudded with a dangerous hope. She traced the letters carefully, her hand shaking, and when he pressed his large hand over hers to steady it, the world beyond the fire faded. For a heartbeat, it was only the 2 of them, her voice, his breath, the word they had written together glowing like prophecy on the scrap of parchment. Rain hammered the canvas of the war tent that night, and the Apache warrior drew the widow inside away from the damp, spreading the captured documents across a rough-hewn table as if they were treasures rather than spoils, his hand lingering on the parchment before he pushed it toward her and said, almost pleading, "Teach." She sat across from him, her hair damp and clinging to her cheeks, and though her heart thundered at being alone with him, the gentleness in his command steadied her. She read slowly, each word carrying the rhythm of her breath, and he repeated them with a determination that startled her, his deep voice shaping foreign syllables into something raw and earnest. When he struggled, she reached across to guide his finger along the line, her hand small against his calloused strength, and the touch lingered until the air between them grew thick with unspoken things. He studied her as intently as the letters, eyes tracing her lips as much as the page, and she felt a warmth coil within her chest that had nothing to do with the fire burning low in the brazier. At one point the candle guttered, plunging them into near darkness, and instinctively he reached for her wrist, steadying her as if the loss of light might take her away, his thumb resting against her pulse until the flame steadied again. She looked into his face then, into the shadows and scars, and the surprising vulnerability hidden in his eyes. And she knew this was no simple exchange of knowledge, but something far more dangerous. Outside, the rain washed the world clean, but inside the tent they were marked forever by that moment, when a warrior who could not read and a widow who thought herself forgotten discovered that each lesson drawn in ink also etched itself deeper into their hearts. The rain had passed by dawn, leaving the air sharp and clean, and as the Apache warrior stepped from the tent, he found himself carrying not only the documents, but the weight of a memory he had long buried, one that rose unbidden as the widow's lessons pressed deeper into his soul. That evening, when the others drifted to their fires and left them alone again, he sat across from her with the pages untouched and his hands clenched on his knees, his jaw tight as stone. She tilted her head, sensing his turmoil, and whispered, "What is it you fear in these words?" His voice came low, rougher than she had yet heard. "When I was a boy, a white trader held a page to my face, laughing as I stared at it like a fool. He called me savage, less than his dog. My father's warriors laughed too, though they did not mean to wound. From that day, I swore no man would see me beg letters from the page." His eyes burned with shame that no battle had ever given him, and he turned his head away, as if her gaze could cut him deeper than any blade. She reached across the rough table, placing her hand over his, the warmth of her touch chasing away the cold years of humiliation, and said softly, "They were wrong. To learn is not weakness. To seek more is the greatest strength of all." He stared at her fingers resting on his skin, then lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time his voice trembled with something like desperation. "Then do not let me be mocked again. Do not let me fail before you." She shook her head, her hair falling loose across her face, and whispered, "You will not fail, not with me." A silence stretched, heavy and fragile, and he slowly turned his hand beneath hers, fingers curling to hold her in return, a bond forged not by conquest, but by the breaking of walls that had stood in his heart for years. In that moment, the warrior who could not read had given her his deepest wound, and the widow who thought herself powerless had answered with the promise of healing, and though neither said the word aloud, both knew the lesson had already changed them forever. The days that followed softened into a rhythm neither had expected, the Apache warrior bringing scraps of paper, charcoals, even a broken slate from some abandoned wagon, and the widow guiding his rough hands through the letters with a patience that carried more tenderness than command. And soon their lessons were no longer silent exercises, but filled with small bursts of laughter, when his tongue twisted, or his hand smeared the ink across the page. Once, when she leaned too close to show him how to form a word, her hair brushed his cheek, and though she pulled back quickly, the warmth of it lingered on his skin like a secret fire. By the river he practiced repeating words, she whispered, his deep voice stumbling but growing steadier, and once he said her name without her prompting, a sound so soft it made her heart lurch in her chest. Yet outside their fragile circle, whispers rose among the camp, men muttering that a widow had no right to sit at the warrior's side, women hissing that she was a captive and could never be more than a bandy. He heard the whispers and ignored them, but the sting was there, a low drumbeat of defiance building inside him. One night, when a young brave sneered too loudly, asking if he would marry his schoolmistress like a boy, the warrior stood, towering over the fire, and silenced the camp with nothing but the weight of his gaze. No one mocked again that night, but the widow felt the danger in their stares, the walls closing in around them, and when she returned to her tent, she pressed her face to her hands, trembling not with fear of him, but of the truth she could no longer deny. She wanted him, not as a pupil, but as the man who had begun to write his heart into hers with every clumsy letter. The widow sat by the fire that evening with her hands folded over a book he had brought, its leather cracked, its pages lined with prayers and laws she had once read to her husband. And now, as she traced the words with her finger, the Apache warrior crouched beside her, his gaze fixed not on the page but on her lips as they shaped each sound. When she paused, he leaned closer, his breath stirring the loose strands of her hair, and asked in a voice that barely carried beyond them, "If I can read, will I be more than what they call me?" She swallowed, the weight of his nearness making her chest tighten, and whispered back, "You are already more." The silence that followed held the sharpness of a blade, balanced between restraint and surrender, and she knew if he moved even an inch closer, the boundary between teacher and student would be broken forever. But before she could answer that unspoken question, a voice from the shadows hissed her name, a warning from one of the elder women, reminding her of the laws that bound captives to servitude and forbade any bond of marriage. The warrior stiffened, fury flaring in his eyes, but she laid a hand on his arm, begging with her touch that he not rise, that he not shatter the fragile safety they still had. He relented, but when the whispers faded into the night, he turned to her again, his voice like low thunder. "They would keep you bound in chains of law, but I—" His words faltered, his throat working, and instead of finishing he reached for the parchment and scrawled a jagged mark across it, then pushed the charcoal into her hand. "Teach me this word," he said, and when she saw what he had meant to write, her own name tangled in broken lines, her heart trembled so violently she almost dropped the page. She guided his hand gently, forming the letters one by one, and when he repeated them, rough and imperfect, it sounded like the truest confession she had ever heard. Still, as the fire died low and the camp grew quiet, they both knew the walls were pressing in, and if they did not choose soon, their fragile bond would be torn apart by forces stronger than either could face alone. The summons came at dawn, when the mist still clung to the river and the camp stirred restlessly, and the widow was pulled from her tent to stand at the center of the council circle, her hair tangled, her dress dirt-streaked, her eyes wide but unbroken, while around her the warriors and elders gathered with faces carved from stone. The Apache warrior entered last, his shoulders squared, his presence darkening the air as if the storm itself had come with him. And though he stood close enough to shield her, the chief raised a hand and declared, "She is a spoil of war, no more. A bandy cannot be wife." The words rippled through the crowd, carried on whispers sharp as knives, and the widow felt her knees weaken under the weight of their judgment. But before she could falter, he stepped forward, his voice ringing clear. "She has given me more than food or fire. She has given me words." Murmurs rose, disbelief thick as smoke, and one elder sneered, "You who cannot read dare claim her as more?" The warrior reached into his vest and pulled out a folded parchment, one of the very documents taken in battle, and held it high for all to see. His hands trembled, his jaw clenched, but he opened it slowly and pressed his finger to a line she had taught him only nights before. The crowd jeered, expecting him to falter, yet when he spoke the single word, broken but clear, "Wife," silence crashed down like thunder over the circle. He turned, his eyes blazing, and repeated it louder, each syllable heavier with defiance. "Wife!" Gasps broke from the women, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads, but the widow's heart leapt, tears burning her eyes as if the single word had freed her from every chain that bound her. The chief's face darkened, his voice low with anger. "You shame us, warrior, standing for a captive against the law." But the warrior did not bow, did not falter, and instead placed the parchment into her hands, as if to prove she was no longer his spoil, but his equal. Around them the circle seethed, torn between outrage and awe, and in that moment it became clear that their defiance would not end in quiet surrender, but in a battle for their right to love. The circle did not break quietly. It roared to life as one of the younger braves surged forward, fury in his eyes, shouting that no outlaw warrior could make a bride of a captive, and his hand shot out to seize the widow's arm as if to drag her back into the shadows of servitude. Before her cry could even form, the Apache warrior moved like lightning, his hand clamping down on the younger man's wrist and twisting until the youth dropped to his knees with a grunt of pain, the firelight glinting off the blade that had appeared in the warrior's other hand. Gasps tore through the crowd, elders rising, women shrieking, children peering wide-eyed from behind skirts, and for a breathless moment it seemed the circle would erupt into violence. Yet the warrior did not strike. Instead, he flung the young man aside and raised his voice, louder than the storm. "She is not spoil. She is not bandy. She is the woman who gave me the power of words, and I will not surrender her." He pulled the widow to his side, his arm firm around her, and the weight of his defiance struck harder than any blade, silencing the jeers as he drew her close enough that the crowd could not mistake his choice. The chief's eyes narrowed, his voice seething with authority. "You would betray your people for her." The warrior's gaze did not waver, and in a voice that carried across the valley he declared, "I betray nothing. I honor what is greater than war. If you call me outlaw, then so be it, for I will be outlaw with her." The widow clung to his arm, trembling not with fear but with awe, for she had never heard such strength spoken in her defense, and though her heart knew the danger of standing against so many, it also knew with a fierce certainty that she would rather die beside him than live without him. The council muttered among themselves, some voices raised in rage, others faltering with unease, but none dared to challenge him again, for the fire in his eyes promised that anyone who tried would face not only his blade, but the truth that had already settled in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. A man who had known only silence and shame had found his voice, and he would use it to claim her against the world. The circle lingered in silence after the clash, the fire popping in nervous sparks, and into that stillness the Apache warrior pulled a parchment from his vest, the same one he had carried since the day of battle, its edges torn, its ink smudged, yet its meaning greater than any treasure. He held it high so all could see, then lowered it into the widow's hands, his fingers covering hers as if to steady not only her trembling but his own. The crowd leaned in, waiting for him to falter, to prove himself the illiterate fool they had always whispered. But instead he fixed his gaze on her, on the woman who had given him more than letters. And with a voice rough but steady, he began to shape the words she had traced into his very bones. "Wife," he said, broken at first, then stronger, each syllable carrying across the gathering until even the chief's face tightened with unease. The widow's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of triumph, for she knew that this single word was no mere lesson. It was a vow, spoken before all who doubted, a declaration that neither law nor scorn could erase. He spoke again, louder, his voice rising until it drowned the whispers of the elders and silenced the jeers of the young. "Wife!" Then he turned fully to her, his hand rising to cup her cheek, his eyes burning with something that was not shame but pride, and in the hush that followed he whispered for her alone. "Not spoil, not captive, mine as I am yours." She leaned into his palm, her tears falling onto his hand, and for the first time since war had torn her world apart, she felt whole. Around them the council shifted uneasily, but no one dared to challenge what had already been claimed in fire and blood and word, and Elias Redfeather, who carried this tale, would always pause here to remind his listeners that sometimes one word can change more than 1,000 battles. The widow and the warrior stood together as the dawn crept over the horizon, the parchment pressed between their joined hands, and though the world might never fully forgive their defiance, it could not deny what they had spoken into being. A union forged not by conquest but by choice, a love born from the ashes of shame and carried into legend by the sound of a single word. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been there in the circle, would you have stood for their vow too?